What if I told you that one of the most unbelievable acts of mercy in all of World War II happened in the next 4 minutes, and almost no one knew about it for nearly half a century? December 20th, 1943. The skies over northern Germany roared like an angry beast. Black smoke curled through the frozen air. Flak bursts flashed against the clouds, and one lonely B-17 bomber limped through the chaos, burning, broken, and moments from a violent end. Inside, its young crew struggled to stay alive, unaware that in just a few minutes, a German fighter would appear behind them, one with every reason to finish them off. But who would instead make a choice that defied the very logic of war? World War II was at its brutal height. Europe lay in ruins, cities were reduced to rubble, and the Allied air campaign had turned the skies into a battlefield of steel. The United States 8th Air Force launched daylight bombing raids over Germany almost daily. These missions were deadly. Entire bomber groups sometimes vanished in a single afternoon. Crews knew the odds. They wrote letters to their families the night before missions, often finishing them with lines like, "If you receive this, I didn't make it back." Flying a B-17 was an honor, but it was also gambling with your life each time the wheels left the runway. Among the thousands of young men who took to the skies was Charlie Brown, a 21-year-old pilot from West Virginia. A quiet, focused farm boy who had suddenly found himself responsible for the lives of 9 other men. He wasn't the kind of commander who barked orders. He wanted his crew to trust him, and they did. They were more than a squad. They were brothers who depended on each other in a world where a single mistake could send all of them plunging into darkness. Their aircraft was a B-17 Flying Fortress they fondly named Ye Old Pub. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't special, but it was theirs. Each man had a job. The co-pilot Spencer Luke keeping the plane level in turbulence, the navigator Al Sadak plotting their course over enemy territory, Bombardier Ralph Pinky Pincock preparing to drop their payload, engineer Bertrand Coulomb maintaining the engines, radio operator Dick Petchout checking frequencies, waist gunners Lloyd Jennings and William Andrew scanning the skies for fighters, Sam Blackford squeezed into the ball turret under the belly of the plane, and tail gunner Hugh Eckenrode guarding their rear. 10 young men, 10 stories that were about to collide with destiny. That frozen morning, the crew received their briefing. They would bomb the Focke-Wulf 190 aircraft factory in Bremen, one of Germany's most important sites. It was heavily defended, a target that had already cost countless Allied lives. As dawn broke, the bomber crews prepared their planes, feeling the cold bite through their gloves. Engines roared to life, sending vibrations through the ground. The runway lights glowed faintly as they took off, climbing slowly into the pale winter sky. Everything went smoothly at first. The formation was tight, the cold was sharp but manageable, and the crew performed their duties with routine efficiency. But as they approached Bremen, black puffs of flak began to appear around them. At first they were distant, then they grew closer, until the sky erupted. Shrapnel tore through the air, slicing into aircraft. One violent blast struck the pub, ripping open its nose, shattering instruments, and wounding the bombardier. Another explosion rocked the tail section. The oxygen system was damaged. The temperature inside dropped dangerously, and frost began forming on the crew's mass. The pub fell behind the formation, an unprotected wounded giant, and that's when the fighters came. German Me-10-9s and FW-19s dove from above, guns blazing. Bullets tore through the fuselage, ripping metal like paper. Waist gunners fired desperately, but the enemy's attacks were relentless. The ball turret shook violently as Sam Blackford tried to track targets below. The radio operator was hit. The tail gunner Hugh Eckenrode was killed instantly. Injuries spread through the crew. Their engines sputtered. Their left outboard engine died entirely. The bomber rolled, dipped, and nearly spun out before Charlie regained control. Blood stained the floor. Smoke filled the cabin. They were alone, dying, 20,000 feet above enemy territory. And then, the sky went quiet. The German fighters suddenly pulled away, having assumed the American bomber was doomed. The pub drifted like a wounded bird. Inside, the crew worked frantically to patch wounds, plug holes in the fuselage, and stop the freezing air from killing them. Charlie fought the controls, trying to keep the bomber from falling apart. They had one hope left. turned toward the North Sea and prayed they could make it home. But someone else had seen them. Franz Stigler, a seasoned Luftwaffe ace with 22 victories to his name, had just finished refueling when he took off once more. As he ascended, he spotted the crippled B-17. Smoke, fire, holes everywhere. It was barely flying. To Stigler, it looked like an easy kill. One more victory that would push him closer to the honors Germany promised its pilots. He closed in behind the bomber, and then he saw something that made him ease off the trigger. Looking through the glass, he saw men desperately tending to each other, trying to save their wounded. He saw bandages soaked in blood. He saw a terrified young pilot at the controls, fighting with everything he had just to keep the plane level. Stigler's finger hovered on the trigger and froze. This wasn't a machine. These were human beings, dying, defeated, no threat to anyone. Suddenly, Stigler remembered the words his commanding officer had told him when he was a young pilot. "You are a fighter pilot. If I ever hear of you killing a man who is parachuting or a man who cannot fight back, I will consider you a murderer, not a soldier." Stigler made his decision. He positioned his fighter beside the bomber, flying wingtip to wingtip. The American crew panicked. They thought he was toying with them. They waited for the finishing shot, but it never came. Instead, Stigler gestured to Charlie, trying to get him to land in Germany and surrender. Charlie refused. He'd rather crash into the sea than give up his crew. Stigler then pointed toward the North Sea, showing them the only route home, and then, in complete defiance of German military law, he escorted them. He flew close enough to hide the B-17 from anti-aircraft guns below. Close enough to provoke suspicion from his own side. Close enough that both aircraft, enemies just minutes before, looked like allies for a brief moment. When they neared the sea, Stigler slowed down. He pulled up beside the cockpit, met Charlie Brown's eyes, and gave a final, respectful salute. Charlie returned it. Then Stigler rolled his aircraft away and vanished into the clouds. Charlie could hardly believe what had happened. The bomber, barely holding together, limped across the water. One engine died, then another. Fuel ran dangerously low. The crew braced for a crash, but the pub somehow reached England, skidding onto a runway with its last remaining strength. Emergency teams pulled the wounded out. The crew survived, most of them because of the mercy of a man they had been taught to hate. When Charlie reported the incident, his commanders dismissed it entirely. They didn't want stories circulating that Germans could be honorable. So the event was buried, forgotten by the military, but never by Charlie. Decades passed. Charlie returned home, built a life, but the memory of the German pilot haunted him. Who was he? Why had he spared them? What kind of man chooses compassion in a war built on hatred? In the late 1980s, Charlie began searching. He wrote letters, looked through records, asked veterans organizations, and then in 1990, he received a letter from Canada. The man wrote, "I was the one who spared your life." It was Franz Stigler. When the two finally met, nearly 47 years after that day, they embraced like brothers. They talked for hours. Stigler told Charlie he couldn't shoot because it would have been like shooting at a man in a parachute. Charlie told Stigler he had given him back his entire life. Their families became close. They visited each other often. These two men, once enemies in the most destructive war in history, became lifelong friends. They died just months apart in 2008, leaving behind a story that stands as one of the greatest acts of chivalry ever witnessed in the sky. And perhaps that is the lesson hidden in the clouds of December 1943. Even in a world torn apart by hatred, chaos, and death, one act of mercy can shine brighter than 1,000 victories. In the darkest moments, humanity can still find a way.